In the low, undulating hills of western Pennsylvania, where the land still bears the wounds of abandoned coal seams, there is a small cemetery that has unsettled historians for more than a century. 7 headstones stand there in rigid alignment, their shapes and inscriptions nearly indistinguishable. Each carries the same surname, Murphy. Each marks the grave of a young man who died at exactly 21 years of age. From 1847 to 1883, every male heir born into the Murphy family met his end on the very day he reached manhood. The causes varied: accidents, misfortune, tragedy. But the pattern was so precise, so unyielding, that eventually local officials stopped asking questions. Buried deep within the Pennsylvania State Archives are more than 300 pages of testimony, medical notes, and sworn statements related to those deaths. In 1884, the entire collection was sealed by order of the state and quietly relocated to a restricted vault in Harrisburg. What follows has never been presented in full, reconstructed from private letters, forgotten court filings, and the personal journals of Dr. Ezra Caldwell, the physician who attended 4 of the Murphy deaths and devoted the last years of his life to what he called, simply, the Murphy curse. But before we descend into that history, pause with me for a moment. If stories like this, dark, forgotten, and deeply human, draw you in, stay with us. These are not tales of folklore or superstition, but of choices made in silence and the cost paid by those without power. The truth behind the Murphy sons is far more disturbing than any ghost story. It is rooted in the brutal realities of 19th century industrial America, family secrets passed like inheritance, and a conspiracy of silence that shielded the powerful while grinding the innocent into the earth. The story begins in 1846, when Seamus Murphy arrived in Millfield, Pennsylvania. The town was new, carved out of the Appalachian foothills some 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Its existence owed entirely to coal. Like countless Irish immigrants fleeing famine, Seamus crossed the Atlantic with little more than endurance and hope. But unlike most, he carried a letter, an introduction from a benefactor in Ireland, whose name he rarely spoke. The letter secured his passage and promised immediate employment with the Keystone Coal and Iron Company. Millfield was a company town in the purest sense. Identical gray houses lined its dusty streets. Keystone owned the mines, the stores, the church, the schoolhouse, even the cemetery. Every aspect of life moved according to corporate decree. The town itself had once been called Greenale, but Keystone rechristened it Millfield, a name stripped of beauty and shaped for efficiency. What truly distinguished Millfield was how its workforce was chosen. Keystone did not simply hire the desperate and the wandering. It recruited entire families from specific regions of Europe, those fleeing famine, unrest, or financial ruin. These families arrived as participants in what company records politely called the settlement program: housing, employment, and security in exchange for long-term commitment. A closed system, a promise that bound. Seamus was 28 when he arrived, older than most recruits. Hardship had etched itself into his face, but he possessed a quick mind and a rare skill among miners. He could read and write fluently in both English and Gaelic. Within weeks, those talents drew the attention of Josiah Bentley, Keystone's operations manager. Bentley was thin, sharp-eyed, and methodical, a man who believed order was forged through control. Under his leadership, Millfield became one of the most profitable mining operations in the state. Seamus was promoted from the mines to the accounting office, an elevation that brought comfort and exposure. The ledgers he maintained tracked far more than wages. They recorded debts, church attendance, school performance, political opinions, private disputes, lives reduced to columns of ink. It was there, among coal-stained books heavy with secrets, that Seamus met Margaret O'Connell. Margaret was the daughter of one of the first Irish families recruited into the settlement program. She worked as a seamstress for supervisors' wives, but her education set her apart. Taught by nuns in Ireland, she could read Latin as well as English, and she possessed a sharp awareness of the contradictions that defined life in Millfield. Their courtship was swift, driven by genuine affection and an unspoken understanding that survival in Millfield's hierarchy favored unity. They married in the fall of 1846 under the watchful sermons of Father McKenna, a priest whose homilies always returned to loyalty, obedience, and acceptance. Their home on Elm Street was better than most, but it came with invisible boundaries. Visitors were noted. Conversations carried. Privacy, they slowly realized, was an illusion. By spring of 1847, Margaret was pregnant, and Seamus attempted to purchase land beyond the town's edge. The transaction came with conditions, agreements that would bind his future children to Keystone employment. The promise of ownership revealed itself as another form of tether. Margaret's pregnancy was troubled. The sickness lingered, but worse were the dreams. She spoke of endless rows of identical graves, each bearing the name of a young man she somehow knew. Dr. Ezra Caldwell prescribed rest and laudanum, but in his private journal, he noted similar visions reported by other women, wives of men whose positions placed them close to the company's inner workings. Millfield itself was tense, coiled. Cave-ins and explosions were common, wages paid in company scrip, debts unavoidable. Union organizers vanished. Families who attempted to leave found themselves trapped by sudden legal or financial ruin. Advancement was rewarded. Independence was punished. It was into this world that Patrick Murphy was born, healthy, strong, and unaware that his fate had been decided before his first breath. Patrick's 21st birthday arrived on March 15, 1868, beneath a cold, gray sky. Snow clung to the mountains, and the air smelled of smoke and iron. Seamus planned a modest celebration, but Patrick seemed withdrawn. He insisted on going to work. Recently promoted to shift supervisor in the deepest tunnel of Shaft 7, he could not risk absence. At 2:17 in the afternoon, a methane explosion tore through the shaft. The blast shook the town. When rescuers reached the site hours later, 11 men were found alive. Patrick Murphy lay at the center, unburned, untouched, as though asleep. Dr. Caldwell later wrote that Patrick had not died from the blast, but from a sudden cessation of life itself. The survivors told a stranger story. Moments before the explosion, Patrick had checked his pocket watch, smiled, and said, "Time's up." Days later, a letter was found in his coat, written weeks earlier, detailing his burial. At the bottom, a single line. "The first payment is made. The debt continues with my brothers." The company sealed the report. A settlement was paid. Life moved on. But Dr. Caldwell kept writing, and 5 years later, the debt came due again. The death of Patrick Murphy settled over the family like coal dust. Fine, suffocating, impossible to fully escape. In time, grief dulled the sharpest questions, and Millfield resumed its familiar rhythm of labor and survival. Seamus buried himself in the company books, as though columns of numbers could silence the echo of his son's final smile. Margaret seemed to age in fast motion, strands of gray threading through her dark hair, her gaze often fixed on things no one else could see. It was Thomas, their second son, who changed most profoundly. Where Patrick had been dutiful and steady, Thomas burned with restlessness. He was intelligent, sharp-tongued, and increasingly unwilling to accept the authority of Keystone's supervisors. Patrick's death gnawed at him. He asked questions others were careful to avoid. He lingered too long over records and reports, and slowly, methodically, he began to investigate. Thomas read everything he could find: safety inspections, old newspaper clippings, accident reports. He tracked down the miners who had survived Shaft 7, many of whom had fled Millfield and refused ever to return underground. What he uncovered chilled him. Shaft 7 had been flagged as unstable weeks before the explosion. Methane levels were dangerously high. More troubling still, Patrick had been ordered to work a double shift that day, in violation of company policy. Among his father's papers, Thomas found a letter signed by Josiah Bentley himself, instructing Patrick to conduct a special inspection of gas pockets on his birthday. When Thomas confronted Seamus, the reaction was immediate and terrifying. His father tore the letter from his hands and fed it to the fire, his voice low and shaking with something darker than anger. Some truths, he warned, were buried for a reason. Dig too deep, and you join the dead. But Thomas could not stop. As his own 21st birthday approached in 1873, his inquiries grew more urgent. Former Keystone workers spoke of vanished Union men, of accidents that followed descent like clockwork. And beneath those stories lay something older, whispered references to agreements made long ago, to obligations inherited like a curse. Blood contracts, the old miners called them, payments that came due on significant birthdays. Always the sons. By early spring, Thomas was unraveling. He carried a pistol, slept poorly, and insisted he was being followed. On the morning of his birthday, March 22nd, a thick fog smothered Millfield, swallowing the surrounding mountains and leaving the town isolated, adrift. Thomas did not go to work. Instead, he climbed the narrow stairs of St. Michael's Church and barricaded himself in the bell tower with a rifle. Father O'Malley found him there during morning prayers. Thomas looked hollowed out, as though fear itself had been feeding on him. He spoke rapidly, desperately, naming names, dates, details that stripped away the priest's skepticism. Patrick's death, he said, had been no accident. It was payment. The explosion timed to the minute, and now they were coming again. At noon, as the bells began to toll, Thomas pointed toward the street below. 3 men in dark coats, he whispered. Outsiders, executioners. The priest saw only fog and moving shapes. When he turned back, Thomas had raised the rifle. The weapon detonated in his hands with impossible force. The blast killed him instantly. When Father O'Malley regained consciousness, he found Thomas kneeling, hands clasped, face peaceful. Later, he would record a detail no official report mentioned. At the moment of Thomas's death, every clock in Millfield stopped for exactly 21 seconds. The company declared the incident an accident, defective ammunition, case closed. But something inside Seamus Murphy finally broke. He stormed into Keystone's offices the day after the funeral, carrying a leather satchel and a fury that frightened even Josiah Bentley. No record remains of what was said behind that closed door. But when Seamus emerged hours later, pale and shaking, the satchel was gone. Bentley canceled all appointments for days, staring endlessly at the mountains beyond his window. After that, Seamus unraveled. Errors appeared in the books. He drank heavily. He spoke too freely about the cost of prosperity. Margaret, meanwhile, began walking the cemetery each evening, studying the graves. Patterns emerged. Dozens of young men, all 21, all dead by accident, all recently offered advancement by Keystone. Their third son, Michael, found what would shatter what little remained of the family's illusions. In a forgotten corner of the church basement, he uncovered contracts, documents written in archaic legal language dating back decades. They bound families to Keystone in exchange for passage, work, and protection. The price was explicit: a tithe of blood. The eldest son, each generation, 21 years of life. When Michael showed the papers to his parents, Seamus destroyed them in terror. Margaret, however, had already made copies. Winter settled over Millfield with unnatural severity. Silence grew heavy inside the Murphy home. On February 14, 1874, Margaret chose defiance. She brought Father O'Malley into the secret. Together, they uncovered a ledger hidden behind the church walls. Records of spiritual transactions, families listed beside dates and obligations. The Murphy entry referenced 7 sons. Their plan was desperate but deliberate: expose everything. But Michael refused to hide. Instead, he confronted Keystone directly. The meeting was chaos. Bentley panicked. The company's lawyer, Ezra Caldwell's cousin, offered silence in exchange for freedom. Michael refused. That night, Bentley died at his desk, terror frozen on his face, a half-written confession clutched in his hand. What followed was a collapse. Officials confessed. Dr. Caldwell's journals surfaced, revealing murders staged as accidents, carried out by traveling professionals. Patrick's explosion, Thomas's sabotaged rifle, a system of industrial slaughter hidden behind paperwork and fear. Michael lived past 21, but survival brought retaliation, threats, violence, fires. Caldwell himself was found dead before testifying. Father O'Malley fled. The Murphy family barely escaped Millfield alive, leaving behind graves and ghosts as they fled west to Oregon. For a time, they believed they were free. They were wrong. When Michael's son Patrick began asking questions, the old shadows returned. This time, the Murphys did not hide. On March 15, 1888, surrounded by armed allies and reporters, young Patrick faced his would-be killers in broad daylight. They were captured. They confessed. The contracts were exposed. In 1889, the last of them was nullified by federal order. Millfield vanished soon after. Keystone collapsed. The cemetery remains. 7 stones, 7 names. Not a curse, not fate. Just men who believed some lives were cheaper than others, and a family that refused at last to agree. The federal ruling of 1889 should have been the end of the story. On paper, it was. The contracts were declared illegal. The system that had fed on immigrant blood was dismantled in courtrooms and committee hearings. Names were recorded, companies fined or dissolved, and new labor protections etched into law. History, as it so often does, tried to close the book. But stories like the Murphys do not end cleanly. They linger. They echo. In Oregon, the family lived cautiously in the years that followed the confrontation in Cedar Falls. Freedom did not arrive with relief so much as exhaustion. Michael carried the weight of survival heavily, aware that he was alive only because others had died loudly enough to finally be heard. He spoke rarely of Pennsylvania, but the past leaked through him in quiet ways. How he checked locks twice before sleeping. How he noted unfamiliar faces in town. How every march brought a tightening around his eyes. Margaret did not live long enough to see the ruling that erased the contracts. Her health had been declining since their flight from Millfield, her body worn down by years of fear that no doctor could diagnose. She died in the winter of 1886, her hands folded as if in prayer, whispering the names of Patrick and Thomas with her final breath. She was buried beneath towering pines, far from the gray hills of Pennsylvania, yet even in death, she never truly left them behind. Seamus survived her by only a year. The man who had once kept perfect ledgers and believed briefly in the promise of order, passed quietly in his sleep. Those who knew him in Oregon remembered a reserved, haunted figure, polite and distant, as though some essential part of him had remained locked in a company office thousands of miles away. Brendan, the youngest, lived longest and spoke least. He became a school principal, then a superintendent, respected and trusted. He never married. Some said he feared passing anything on: names, memories, blood. When asked about his brothers, he would pause, then say only that they had died young, as many did in those days. Nothing more. Michael watched his son Patrick grow with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. He discouraged questions. He hid documents. He believed silence might finally break the chain. But history has a way of asserting itself, especially when it has been buried improperly. Patrick Murphy Jr. inherited his grandmother's intelligence and his uncle's restlessness. By 16, he was already pulling at loose threads: old newspapers, whispered conversations among labor men, rumors that had survived in footnotes and scars. Despite Michael's warnings, the boy searched, and the more he learned, the more he understood that the Murphy story was not an isolated horror, but a single vein in a vast and ugly body. Across the country, similar patterns emerged. Young men dead at the edge of adulthood, accidents that benefited employers, settlements paid swiftly, questions smothered. Keystone Coal and Iron had been only one name among many. The machinery of exploitation adapted, rebranded, moved west, then south, then back east again. Contracts dissolved on paper did not erase the instincts that created them. By the time Patrick Jr. turned 21, the family no longer believed in hiding. They believed in witnesses. The gathering in Cedar Falls was not just a celebration. It was a declaration. 50 armed supporters, reporters with notebooks open, a public square transformed into a stage where secrecy could not survive. When the three men in dark coats approached, they did so without subtlety, as if confident the old rules still applied. They were wrong. The arrest of those men, and their subsequent confessions, cracked open doors long sealed. Investigations spread across 12 states. Families came forward with stories that mirrored the Murphys too closely to dismiss. Industrialists who had never expected to see the inside of a courtroom found themselves named, charged, and in some cases imprisoned. Others fled. A few disappeared. Patrick Murphy Jr. lived to see his children grow without counting the years in fear. He died an old man, surrounded by family, his name no longer a marker of scheduled death, but of resistance. Back in Pennsylvania, Millfield faded. Without Keystone, the town had no reason to exist. Buildings rotted, roads vanished under weeds, the mines flooded and collapsed, sealing their secrets in darkness. Today, only foundations remain, and the cemetery, overgrown, quiet, avoided. 7 stones still stand there, identical, unadorned. No mention of contracts or courts or courage, just names and dates that stopped too soon. Dr. Ezra Caldwell's journals, published after his death, became essential reading for reformers and investigators. His meticulous records exposed not only what had been done, but how easily it had been hidden. His work reshaped how industrial accidents were examined, how death certificates were questioned, how silence itself became suspect. Yet even Caldwell understood something unsettling. Systems like the one that consumed the Murphys do not vanish. They retreat. They change language. They trade ledgers for algorithms, overseers for executives, contracts written in blood for ones signed in ink and buried in fine print. The Murphy sons did not die because of curses or dark magic. They died because powerful men decided their lives were expendable, because desperation is easy to exploit, because silence is cheaper than justice. Their story survives not as a ghost tale, but as a warning. In forgotten towns, in neglected archives, in the quiet spaces where progress is praised and its costs ignored, there are still remnants of agreements made without consent and debts paid by those who never agreed to owe them. The hills of western Pennsylvania are quiet now. The mines are sealed. The town is gone. But the question remains: how many stories like Millfield's were never exposed? How many names never made it into journals or court records? How many contracts were fulfilled without resistance? The Murphy family broke one chain. Others may still be waiting. And history, patient and unforgiving, remembers everything.